Hi, and welcome back. This is Milton Shupe, continuing our series of Gmax 1.2 for the beginning modeler. This is video number 37, Introduction and Preparation for Texture Mapping, Part 1. What I hope to achieve in this video and the next, and maybe the third, is to explain the mapping process and the types of mapping that we will use in these videos for our aircraft project. There are many kinds of mapping and lots of capabilities, but we're going to be restricting ourselves to using only two to keep it simple. The second objective would be to help you gain understanding of the preparation necessary to organize the mapping process to save you time, to keep you productive, and prevent redos. So with that, let's talk about the key points. Basically, I just want to introduce you slowly. A lot of things that we could talk about. I'm going to restrict the discussion to those things we need to know to get you started and not get too tied up in a lot of other things that just are not pertinent right now. So, key points. What is texture mapping? Well, texture mapping is the way we assign various parts of the aircraft to a texture sheet. Well, what's a texture sheet? A texture sheet can be something you start with or something that you're going to generate. For example, I may have pictures of wheels, tires or tire tread, prop blades, etc. that I want to map these polys to. So I may begin with a texture map, and I can pop one up here just to show you. Here we go. If you look at the wheels here, this area of this wheel and tire is mapped right here on this texture sheet. This texture sheet is a 1024. It's just showing smaller here. That's the outside of the wheel. The inside of the wheel is mapped to this part of the texture sheet. So you can see that you can build texture sheets to use in your projects and apply parts of your aircraft polys to these areas of your texture sheet. Same with the prop blades, or maybe your oleo suspension, various parts, color swatches, whatever you need. A landing light, picture of the lens. So that would be a texture sheet that we could start out with, that we can map some objects to. The other kind of texture sheet is one that we will generate when we start with something new, like the aircraft fuselage or the wings, and we have to generate that. Well, what do they look like? They look like this. This is the fuselage after it has been mapped and exported to Lith Unwrap, L-I-T-H, Unwrap. And you can get this program free of charge, or this application free of charge, and I've provided a link below for you to download that, and an associate application called Quake 3, which is the file or the application that gives us the file type that we're going to export and then import into Lith Unwrap so that we can view what we've just mapped, and then we can save this after we're happy with our mapping to a bitmap file that we will then use to apply to the aircraft, and that's what this looks like. So this is the output of Lith Unwrap. This is what we export once we've mapped the fuselage to Lith Unwrap. Then Lith Unwrap is a very nice guy. He saves this as a bitmap for us in whatever size we need it saved as, and it looks like this. And the colors vary here because of the parts involved. Here you see a top of the fuselage, and these are labeled these are labeled. Well, you can't see it that well there. Fuselage top, bottom, left side, right side, etc. And these are labeled and colored to help the painter or the texture artist delineate lines and areas of the surface. You see the gun ports here and here. You can see the nose gear doors here. These are all different parts, so they come in a different color. You see the cannon ports up here. And up here we have a canopy. Here we have the nose gear wheel well and the inside of the gear doors. And here we have the pilot entry-exit area inside the aircraft that's mapped for textures. So this is an example of the output of a mapping process and a texture map that we will generate. So those are the two kinds of texture sheets you'll have. Ones that you have textures on that you want to map to, and then ones that we will generate through the mapping process of things like the fuselage, wings, tails, etc. So those are basically the two kinds of texture sheets we have. You're going to hear terms like UVW coordinates and whatever, and we'll get into that at a later time. But basically, UVW coordinates are things that are associated with. Let's just turn this around so we can look at it in its natural state. UVW coordinates are essentially like XYZ coordinates in the Gmax world. UVW essentially equates to XYZ, but we're talking about object space, not Gmax space, so they tend to use a different term. You don't have to get hung up with that. It doesn't matter. When you do the UVW mapping, you'll notice that the XYZ coordinates down here are the coordinates for this gizmo, this yellow object with a green side. And you don't see anything about UVW there, do you? Well, UVW equates to X, Y, Z, so it's UVW. That's all you need to know. You can basically forget about it, except for the fact that we're UVW mapping, not XYZ mapping. Same thing. Okay, and you can see that this texture lens here was mapped to a texture sheet called Land Light. We could pull that up, I guess. And there it is. It's mapped to this area right here. So that's the texture sheet we already created. And we just mapped that lens right to there. Let's go to the front view. Alright, so that's what that's all about. So, now let's talk about the implications of mapping 3D objects. Let's get rid of some of the stuff here so we can talk a little easier about things. Let's talk about the implications of mapping 3D objects to a 2D or flat texture sheet. Remember when we started the project, we tried to create a 3D object from a 2D 3 view? Remember how much fun that was? And the frustrations involved of trying to get the tops and the sides and all that sorted out so that we could shape everything just right. And especially, you remember this windshield thing we went through, trying to get the shape just right for that, looking at the top view and the side view, and they didn't quite match up. You'll find that's pretty common. But sometimes it's pretty difficult when you're trying to create a 3D object from a 2D 3 view, flat, planar kind of 3 view versus the 3D object. Well, guess what? We're coming full circle here in that now we have to put textures on a 3D object from a 2D plane. The texture sheets are flat, but we've got to wrap that flat texture around the 3D object. Now, how do you do that without it stretching and pulling? If you look at the fuselage head on here, let's just close that. You look at the fuselage head on here, and you can see the lines. How do we go about, let's really zoom in on this, how do we go about taking a texture sheet that's flat and applying it to this? As you go up and around the fuselage, you get up here to a 45-degree angle. Now we're talking, we've got fewer pixels involved, or the same pixels involved as down here on that texture sheet. Now they're going to be spread. There's no more polys or faces in this area than there are here, but because we're spreading them kind of across and across, what happens is you get fewer pixels across these polys, and you get what you call texture stretching. So that has to be dealt with. Now you would think if we could map this just as one big circular object and then lay it out on a flat plane, that would be simple. Well, you could do that. Unfortunately, those are very difficult for painters and texture artists to deal with. So what we do then is break this circle down, if you will, looking at it from the side, and decide, okay, anything less than 45 degrees, let's go into poly mode here, anything less than 45 degrees, I'm going to map from this direction. Anything more than 45 degrees up here, I'm going to map from the top. So we'll map that from the top. We'll map this from the side, and the bottom polys down here that fit the criteria, we'll map from the bottom. So we'll map this side, we'll map this side, we'll map the top, and we'll map the bottom. And that's how we end up with a right side, a left side, a top, and a bottom. And it's up to the texture artist then to take those surfaces and make sure that when he's painting lines, particularly ones that go this way, that they all match up. So it's pretty important when we map these to try to get all these sides lined up, and you can see that these are, but this one's turned around the other direction. Well, fortunately, the texture artist can swap these horizontally, so he could do it to this side and then just flip it and drag it down and apply it here. So they've got all kinds of tools just like we do to make the job easier. So that's how you deal with mapping cylindrical objects on a flat plane, just the way we had to build a 3D object from a 2D picture. I mean, it's weird, but here we are going back full circle. And then we're going to throw the onus on the texture artists, poor guys. Yeah, they got it easy. No, they don't really. They work really hard to bring your aircraft to life. You basically create the palette for the artist, and then the artists get to work and make it look realistic. That's, at least hopefully that's what they do. At least that's been my experience. So when we map, we have to be very careful about not exceeding this 45 limit when we're mapping the side. I mean, I usually start out mapping or selecting a half, and then come back and take away from that half those parts I want on the top and those parts I want on the bottom, and we'll get into that, how we do that, in the next video. So that's a little bit about the implications of mapping 3D objects to a 2D texture sheet. Now, there is a cylindrical mapping that I do use, and on occasion, not often. And I use that for why? Well, for tire tread. If you look at the tire, no, I think I collapsed that. Let's look at this one. No, there it is. Now there's a cylindrical map. You notice that instead of a flat rectangular shape, I've got a cylindrical mapping on this, and the texture. Take a look at that texture just out of curiosity. I can find it here. Tire tread, view the image. Here's the texture. Yeah, it's on the, I'll make sure it was in the video. Here's the texture on the bottom. So what I've done is wrapped this tire tread texture around this tire using cylindrical mapping. So once you have this laid out, it's just a matter of take a look at the parameters. These are the mapping types that are available to you. Planar, which is what we'll use 98% of the time, 99% of the time, and cylindrical, which you can use on things, round things like this, to wrap a texture around it. I've also used that on occasion on engine nacelles that were pretty round. I've used it on prop spinners, and as a matter of fact, I used it on this prop spinner. Let's take a look at that. Just trying to introduce you to some of the types of mapping that are available to you. Well, I don't think I have it applied on this one. So, but I think this was, because I built this new. Well, I built all of this new, but what I did was pull some of this from the other aircraft that I have completed once we got through the building process, just to kind of give it some life and some interest point. Okay, so those are the two. Sorry, let's see, where was that tire tread? So these are the mapping types that you'll use: planar and cylinder. And like I said, 99% of it's going to be planar, so it's flat surface application of textures against mainly round surfaces, elongated or otherwise. Spherical, I can't think of a time when I ever used it. I suppose you could use that for anything close to spherical, like maybe knobs on your engine control unit for throttle or mixture or props, whatever. Shrink wrap I've never used. Those are things you use, for other kinds of mapping. A box wrap gives you automatic 6-sided mapping coordinates, and these I've never used. So, this is what we're going to be focused on here: planar and cylindrical. So those are the kinds of mapping that we'll be doing. And for a little light reading, you don't have to get into it deeply, but if you go to help and look at the user reference for mapping, there's some things you can read here. Don't get too involved in this stuff, but you can at least get a sense of what it's all about. We're not going to get into most of that. We'll touch on just a couple of things depending on what we're mapping, but no sense clogging up your brain as we're trying to get through a learning process here. Alright, so let's talk about texture sheet sizes. Remember, I pulled up this. Texture sheet size is important because of a number of things. Number one, you want it big enough for the texture artist to be able to work with and provide some detail. Secondly, you want Flight Sim requires that we use and restrict our use to powers of 2 in selecting texture sizes. So you're talking about 1024 or 512 or 256 or 128 or 64 or 32. Actually, you can go up to, I usually export these maps and send them to the texture artist or painters as 2048s to give them more working space and work on more detail. And then for FS9, it has a maximum size limit of 1024 by 1024, at least for the texture folders. You can use a little bit bigger than that in panel folders, I think 1536 in the panel folder. But texture folders 1024. Now you go to FSX, you can go up to 4096. So big texture sheets, and you can put a lot more on them, obviously. But there's another thing that's critical about texture sheet sizes, and typically you're going to use 1024 by 1024 in the sim. For some smaller textures that you may have mapped to instead of generated, you may find some 512s or even some 256s. But generally, we're going to use 1024, even though I will export these and give them to the painters as 2048s. When they come back to the sim, they're going to be 1024s. So that's just convenience for the painters and texture artists. But there's one final thing that's critical. When you're deciding what size to make this, and generally you want them as big as possible if it's covering exterior body parts, and you want them to be agreeable between the fuselage, the wings, and the tails. Otherwise, you end up with a different resolution for the texture artist to deal with, and that means that if he's doing lines, panel lines, or rivets, as an example, that the panel lines and rivets have to be a different size for him if you're shipping him a 512 instead of a 1024, because you didn't need all that texture sheet space. So it's important, once you settle on something for either wing size, mapping size for either wings or fuselage, that you kind of stick to that resolution for the texture artist convenience, make his life a little easier. All right, and the last part of this, of course, is resolution considerations for high fidelity. And here we're talking about pixels per inch. So if I'm doing a 747, which is about 4 times longer, or maybe 5 times longer than this aircraft, this fuselage is 36 feet long. I don't know how long a 747 is, but it's a heck of a lot longer than 36 feet. So if I'm trying to squeeze that on a 1024, I'm going to be very low resolution because I don't have a lot of pixels per inch to give to the texture artist to do any kind of detail. So how do you deal with that? Well, for larger aircraft, what I usually do is split the fuselage in half, and I'll map the front half to fill up the sheet, front half and each of its sides, to fill up this whole sheet, and do the same thing with the rear half. And that gives me twice as many pixels per inch as I would have otherwise. So that's the consideration. For example, this fuselage is 36 feet long, and if this is on a 1024 sheet, I only have, this is not a high fidelity mapping here, I only have 2.4 pixels per inch. Well, 2.4 pixels per inch doesn't give the texture artist much leeway to be able to create a rivet or a line. I mean, he's working pretty small here, and that's another reason why I send him a texture sheet that's twice the size of this one. It doesn't improve the end result 1024 texture sheet, but at least it allows him to not kill his eyes trying to paint something this small. Okay, so what do you need for good resolution? Well, I would say ideally above 9 pixels per inch, maybe 12 pixels per inch. So you can do the computations and figure out what you need, but for this aircraft, which I really did for this project, I wasn't concerned that much with high fidelity, so I pushed it. I want 11 meters on my UVW size to do this. Now, if I wanted a high resolution on an aircraft this long, I would split this up and given half of this fuselage that many extra pixels. So that would only push me up to 5, which, you know, at a distance 20 to 30 feet is not bad, but you just got to decide what you want to do. If you want super high resolution, like in the cockpit, then yeah, you got to go with 9 or 12 pixels per inch at least. But virtual cockpit's a different story. Externally, you're typically viewing this aircraft at 20 to 30 feet or more, so you don't have to. It's not like you're 2 feet from the aircraft when you're looking at details, so like you are in the virtual cockpit. So keep that in mind. Pixels per inch, do the computation. Just divide the 1024 by the number of inches in the length of this, be it in meters or in feet, and see what you come up with pixels per inch, and then you can determine if you're high resolution or not. And remember, when you're deciding what side to go with, like I said, I went with 11 meters for this, and that was good because my wing span was very close to the length of the fuselage. My wings were able to fit on 1024 just like this, so I ended up the same resolution, and the tails were no problem either. There, even more space left here, but see, there's a lot of space, a lot of territory left here, but as you complete your modeling, you'll run into other things that you'll need to add, so that's what these spaces are here for. And once you get these texture sheets done, you want to go in and label them for your texture artist or your painter, so he can identify them easily. Usually they're pretty good at this. They've done plenty of them, so they know what it is exactly. Now you get up to something like this, they'll have to look to figure it out, but because they're multicolored, you can just look at the aircraft in the sim and see where those parts are. So it's not undoable. They can do it, and they're good at it. So that's it for the texture sheets and texture sheet sizes and resolutions. So what I intend to do in the next video is to map. Let's go to a select name selection here, map fuselage. Anything you're going to map and group together into a texture map like we were just looking at, you can select out those parts and give them a name selection so they're easy to pull up, and you can hide unselected. And when you're mapping, usually you want your animation slider back at 0, or it will be kind of confusing. So this is what we're going to map next go around, next video. If you open these, you'll see also that there's the interior walls of the pilot entry exit area and the nose gear well have to be mapped as well. So that's the challenge for the next video. And what we'll talk about there is how to get yourself prepared to do the selections of all these polys in this in the scene here, and how to keep control of it, how to organize yourself, and procedurally how to go through it, and how to use the various tools available to you and the various view tools available to you to test your work as you're going, your selections and your applications of names, selections, and it'll take a little time, but I will get through it, and we'll try to make the process easy and as successful as possible without errors. So that's what the focus will be next time. So we've talked about the various mapping types, planar and cylindrical. That's all we'll be using, planar, in this exercise. We've talked about, and we're going to talk next video about the understanding of the preparation necessary to organize the mapping process. But we've talked about texture mapping, texture sheets, the implications of mapping 3D objects against 2D texture sheets and the application thereof. Now we've talked about texture sheet sizes, 2048 to the texture artist, but in the sim 1024, 512, 256, 124, 64. And they don't have to be rectangular, they can be like 1024 by 256 if that's what works for you, and you can save a lot of megabytes going into the sim. And we know that FS9 uses a maximum size of 1024 by 1024. And the last point, very important point, was the resolution considerations. Creating a map size that works for the sim, works for the texture artist, and gives you a good pixels per inch resolution. So that's kind of the summary of what we've covered in this video, and I hope it's been instructional, and we'll start picking at that little by little the next video. So thanks for joining. If you have any comments, chunk them down below, and thanks for joining, and have a good day.